Reč ima gospodin Gidеона Грајф, naš prijatelj iz Izraela, autor knjige Јасеновац-Аушвиц Балканa. Gospodin Gidеона Грајф.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here today. Before starting my speech, I would like to hand over my latest book, which you have mentioned, Mr. Chairman, to you as a present from me personally. Here is Јасеновац-Аушвиц of the Balkans as a gift for you. Ladies and gentlemen, today we are gathered here to pay tribute to the victims of war all over the world. Today we are here to raise our voice against wars and to raise awareness of the challenges that mankind faces today. It is our moral obligation and our duty to all of our nations. Ongoing wars and the issue of rehabilitation of ideologies that contain religious, racial, and other kinds of exclusivism should represent a concern for every person on this planet. We should mobilize the international public to contribute to the United Nations efforts to preserve the universal values of humanity. It is our moral obligation to be here today. Everybody has their Kosovo to fight for. Great American President Woodrow Wilson said in 1918 that Kosovo is the Serbian Jerusalem. There is no front and no rear line of a battlefield anymore. At any time, anywhere, we can be a target. Are we aware of it? It is a thin line between enjoying the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted by United Nations on December 10th, 1948, and abyss of oblivion of scourges of world wars, of those whose only rule was those who have power have right. On the wrecks of the world values and civilization destroyed by the Nazi regime after World War II, nations of the world established the United Nations. The United Nations represent the highest home of the peoples of the world, fostering the spirit of unity in diversity. In light of the migrant crisis in Europe and the world, the international community condemns extremism, religious intolerance, and terrorism. By founding the United Nations way back in 1945, mankind opted the world, peace and freedom of peoples. In order to ensure the rule of law and life in dignity of the human person, on December 10th, 1948, at Palais de Chaillot, at the General Assembly session of the United Nations, a landmark achievement was inaugurated, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That day is observed as Human Rights Day. It was voted on in France, a country where human thought found the noblest of expressions, liberté, égalité, and fraternité. It is no coincidence, then, that the declaration was adopted in a country where in 1789 the Declaration on the Rights of Man and Citizens was espoused in Paris, its capital and bastion of freedom, and at Palais de Chaillot, rather symbolically in the Museum of Man. In this respect, ladies and gentlemen, I wrote the Special Rapporteur, respectable Mrs. High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mrs. Bachelet-Geraya, expressing my deepest concern and certification of a growing trend of neo-Ustashism, especially among young people. I asked of her to take an action as the Special Rapporteur and address this issue of public use of the salute Zadom Spremni, the use of Ustasha insignia, like the Croat coat of arms with first white field which is proven Nazi Ustascha symbol from World War II, and raised my voice against Bleiburg gathering in Austria, organized by Neo-Ustascha movement and, unfortunately, sponsored by present Croat government. Bleiburg is every year in May, and it is the biggest Ustascha Nazi gathering in Europe, where several tens of thousands of Neo-Ustascha and Neo-Nazis gather. In Germany, such a use of Nazi insignia and salutes is forbidden by law. United Nations, as the largest and most influential international organization for peace, should address this dangerous issue within the scope of its responsibilities to humanity in order to prevent the Neo-Ustascha Croat case from becoming encouragement to other neo-Nazi movements worldwide. Ladies and gentlemen, the weakness of the Weimar Republic brought National Socialist Party to power. We should ask ourselves, are our democracies today strong enough to resist violent trends in world policies and international relations of the states? Never in the history of humanity did we speak so much about peace, and never had we so many wars and so open neo-Nazi waves in the world, and some even openly tolerated by their governments. Explicitly no. I'm afraid that democracies learned nothing from the sad fate of the Weimar Republic. It seems to me that they are ashamed to protect themselves and hesitate to do so. Such weakness is abused by evil powers who know how to observe and identify such weakness and exploit it. If I'm asked to formulate one consequence of World War II and the Holocaust, it is this, that we are obliged to fight tyranny and dictatorship from the very beginning, before it becomes too late. Tyranny is dangerous and murderous not only for others, but for their own people as well. In my recently published book, Јасеновац-Аушвиц of the Balkans, Ustascha Empire of Cruelty, I focused on the phenomenon of the two most notorious and most brutal extermination camps in history and World War II, Auschwitz and Jasenovac. I made the first comparative analysis of the two camps and did come to the conclusion that Jasenovac was even more brutal. I've also noted 57 methods of torture and killing which the Croats introduced in that camp. What kind of conclusion do we make of it? Well, several. First, that atrocity perpetrated in camps of death, especially in Jasenovac and martyrdom of Serbs, Jews, Roma and anti-fascists, belong to the most horrible crimes in the whole history of mankind. Second, that all of the camps, especially camps of death, were the lowest level to which mankind could fall. Therefore, out of revolt, the humanity, after two world wars in the 20th century, the World Organization of Peace, the United Nations, was established. The preamble says, we, the peoples of the United Nations, are determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and life worth living of a human being, in the equal rights of men and women and the nations, large and small. For Serbian people and the entire world, it is heartbreaking that 91 members of the Tesla family were brutally murdered by Ustascha killers, 40 of them inside Jasenovac, the relatives of Tesla who brought the light to humanity. And it is also heartbreaking that about a dozen of Dr. Theodor Herzl's family were murdered in Jasenovac. It shows the limitless cruelty of the Nazi Ustascha, who despised every human value and enjoyed murdering innocent people. It is a big tragedy that the Serbian people lost so many members of the Tesla family and that the Jewish people lost so many members of the Herzl family. On March 24, 1999, at 7 p.m., NATO forces started airstrikes on targets in Yugoslavia. After the Secretary General of NATO, Javier Solana, had announced that he ordered the initiation of such operations in the last evening of March 23rd. Even if the Yugoslavian government had declared a state of emergency hours before the strikes due to an imminent threat of war against Yugoslavia by NATO, but despite all the strikes came as a surprise to ordinary people of Yugoslavia who could not believe that after the World War II they would be victims of bombing in Europe of 21st century. Also, the Yugoslav public expected that there was still time for diplomacy. NATO, however, thought otherwise and started its bombing. Part of the NATO forces led by the USA were Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, Spain, Turkey, and the United Kingdom. For Germany, which played, as we will see, a central part in the justification of the bombardments, it was the first military campaign after World War II. But as we all know, the bombardment happened even without the support of Security Council and, according to Human Rights Watch, caused between 489 and 528 civilian casualties within the Yugoslavian population. According to Yugoslav government, the number of casualties for 78 days and nights of bombing in 1999 was over 3,500 people and over 12,000 injured by cluster bombs and bombs with depleted uranium. These civil victims of the bombardments were killed within 90 separate incidents during Operation Allied Force. The bombardments also destroyed bridges, industrial plants, public buildings, private businesses, along with barracks and military installations. A report by the human rights organization Amnesty, International, came to the conclusion that NATO forces had deliberately targeted a civilian object during the strikes. This report relates to the attack on the radio television of Serbia headquarters on April 23rd. During the bombing, 16 people were killed. Due to an estimate of the year 2006, the economic losses resulting from the bombings were about 29.6 billion US dollars. Not only did the bombardings cause a high number of civilian casualties within Yugoslavia, destroyed families, existence, and the infrastructure of a whole country. From today's standpoint, we also have to conclude that the bombings did not achieve their goal. Of course, the Yugoslav government finally agreed to the establishment of a peacekeeping force in Kosovo, and Yugoslav security forces withdrew from Kosovo, but this did not mean the end of the killing in the region as NATO had hoped. Instead, the killing continued. While most Albanian refugees were able to return home within a few weeks or months after the war, huge parts of the non-Albanian population of Kosovo had to flee to other parts of Serbia or to especially protected areas in Kosovo. Also, Albanian KLA, so-called Kosovo Liberation Army, the terrorist activities continued within Kosovo and even spread to other parts of Serbia and to the Republic of North Macedonia up to the year of 2001. In that same year, a report by Human Rights Watch concluded that since June 12, 1999, after the end of NATO bombing and with the presence of the UN forces in Kosovo, as many as 1,000 Serbs and Roma have been murdered or have gone missing. According to Dick Martyr's reports, Serbs were kidnapped and taken to Yellow House, where the human organs were taken from them and sold by Kosovar Albanians and others. And in the report by the Serbian government, it has been stated that between June 10, 1999 and November 11, 2001, when NATO forces had been in Kosovo, 847 people, both civilians and military, have been killed and 1,154 been kidnapped. Additionally, it is estimated that 200,000 Serbs and Roma fled Kosovo after the war. Roma people were also harassed by Albanians and driven out of the country. In November 1999, the Red Cross had registered 247,391 Serb refugees. These facts, ladies and gentlemen, show that the NATO intervention was based on a wrong assessment of the conflict in Kosovo. While NATO assumed that the violence was solely conducted by Serbian forces, in fact the situation was not that clear. This wrong assessment is reflected in the high number of killings after the retreat of Yugoslav forces. The ones who had to pay for this wrong assessment were, of course, the victims among the Serbian population. Those responsible for the NATO bombings until today justify the bombings and argue that they led to the decision of the Yugoslavian government to allow UN troops in the Kosovo to withdraw its own security forces. However, there are others who are confident that the whole military campaign, all bombings and all killings of Serbian civilians could have been prevented by concentrating on diplomacy instead of launching military strikes. So what is the moral and historical lesson of the bombardments? It can be an insightful example that superpowers should be cautious in assessments and not interfere militarily so enthusiastically in cases which endanger civil population. Especially, they should not consider themselves the judge of the world or some kind of world police in areas of the world which have a very complicated history and in the light of every complicated conflicts and crisis. For me, as historian who dedicated all his life to concentration and extermination camps of World War II, some of the statements of world politicians were shocking. Namely, in their statements to justify the attacks, Clinton and his government, as well as Germany, did not hesitate to compare the situation in Kosovo with the Holocaust and called it a genocide. Clinton's Secretary of Defense, William Cohen, said, "The appalling accounts of mass killing in Kosovo and the picture of refugees fleeing Serb oppression for their lives makes it clear that this is a fight for justice over genocide." And President Clinton himself, according to CNN, accused Serbia of ethnic cleansing in Kosovo, similar to the genocide of Jews in World War II. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to repeat and underline that for Germany, which played a central part in the justification of the bombardments, it was the first military campaign after World War II. German Foreign Minister Joschka Fischer legitimized the first German military attack on another country after World War II with the following words: "I have two basic principles. Never again war, never again Auschwitz, never again genocide, never again fascism. For me, both are connected." From today's perspective, the equalization of Auschwitz and the killing in Kosovo seem awfully wrong. The former General Heinz Lockel criticized Fischer's statement very strongly, and I have to agree with him. He said, "Here I really have to control myself because the comparison between Auschwitz and the situation in Kosovo is such an outrageous claim. As a German, one has to be ashamed the German minister did such a thing, because a normal German would have been called to court if he had played down the reality of Auschwitz in such a way." Besides a different attitude towards military interventions, how can we prevent that such a tragedy will happen in the future? In addition to a strong belief in diplomatic measures, a better investigation in the background and nature of a crisis could be central cornerstone to prevent a repetition of a tragedy like the NATO bombings of Serbia and ex-Yugoslavia. If NATO had concentrated on better intelligence service, they would have known that the situation in Kosovo was not as they believed to be, or at least as they presented it to the public. To justify the attacks, officials from the USA and also from other countries like Germany presented secret information that later proved to be wrong or at least as widely exaggerated. Also, if the intelligence services of the NATO countries had done their job and if the military and political leaders had listened to them, they would have known that the situation was much more complicated and that it was not to be solved by military intervention or even by bombings that would hurt and kill a high number of civilians. The proof of that is that even today, 20 years later, after the military intervention, nothing is resolved. But at least the negotiations and dialogue should be a much better way than even 1 hour of war and 1 hour of bombings. By not doing so, the NATO caused a huge suffering within the Serbian population, especially because of bombings with depleted uranium. Many people in Serbia suffered from cancer, a lot are and children are born with cancer and are traumatized until today, and the whole generation will never forget the dark experience of the bombardments. In historical retrospective, the bombardments can be interpreted as a failure of diplomacy and a surrender to the evil powers in the region instead of respecting the decent and reasonable side of the conflict. Sometimes there is no choice but to use military power, but it should always remain the last option. In case of civil war in the Balkans and NATO military campaign in 1999, not one single problem was generally solved by the bombings. Their only true effect was horrible suffering and death of many civilians, which should have been avoided. In the atomic era we live in, we should be aware of tremendous challenge like no other in the history of civilization. In World War III, there would be no winners. We should all think deeply about this question, quo vadis. Ladies and gentlemen, to conclude my speech, as the founder and director of GH7, historian and scholar who spent 31 years at the head of Yad Vashem, at present educator in Holocaust at universities in many countries, and author of many scientific articles and books, I must admit that I have the obligation and duty to address you and offer my absolute support to the United Nations in combating glorification and practices of Nazism, especially in Croatia. My duty to do more than just writing about the problem of neo-Nazism is even bigger in this time of resurgent anti-Semitic streams throughout Europe, where Jewish people again have to feel danger. This is an absolutely dangerous situation which has to be prevented. Thank you for your attention.